Sure.
What do you want me to put it back on the webinar?
On the.
There you go.
Welcome everybody. I'm Shannon Spasova. I'm from Michigan State University. I'm one of the webinar coordinators for IELTS, and we have a couple other webinar coordinators here, Evan Rubin and also Adolfo Carrillo Cabello. And so if you have any questions, any problems, you can chat to one of us in the private chat. In order to get ready for the webinar, you can hover over your screen and click chat. You can talk to anybody in the room. You can talk to somebody privately, and this is how we collect questions. We do have some questions prepared in advance from some that you submitted earlier. But if questions come up along the way, then please feel free to type them into the chat. This is the webinar series for IELTS, International Association for Language Learning Technology. Usually it's once a month, and usually I give people a lot of advance time before I ask them to do a webinar. But this time we're trying to do about one per week or so to help us all get through this crisis. And so I really appreciate our panelists today, Trish, Angelika, and George, for agreeing to do this with very little notice. We really appreciate you telling us about your experience and your ideas on some of these questions that we have. So we are asking everybody for the webinar to keep your microphone muted and also to keep your webcam off unless you're a presenter. Zoom is holding up incredibly well, but from time to time we've seen some problems. So keeping those off we think will help. So without any further ado, thank you very much to our three presenters for agreeing to again help us with their experience and expertise. Thank you, Trish, Angelika, and George.
My pleasure, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, delighted to be here.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm going to be running the slides.
And we
so
don't
y'all
see
just
them yet, Trish, so you might have to share again. I don't see them at least.
Okay. I hadn't actually shared them yet.
Oh, okay. Thanks. There we go.
There you go. So do we want to start with introductions, or shall we just move on to the burning questions?
Yeah, well, let's do introductions super quick. I'm Angelika. I'm the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
I'm Trish. I am the director of the Center for International Resources and Collaborative Language Engagement, the Language Lab, at Georgia State University.
Hey everybody, I'm George, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence at the University of Houston downtown, and I also teach French online as well.
All right, so all of these questions were collected from the registration, and this is kind of a no big coordinated PowerPoint. It's just the questions, so let's go with it.
So are we going to do this? Are we going to read them out loud and then respond?
Yeah, let's read them out loud and then respond.
It's like we're talking to ourselves.
Okay, I'll read them out loud. What are the best alternatives for instructors who teach in-person language courses, normally meeting Monday through Thursday, and their students don't have home access to computers or the internet?
If I could take that really quickly, just one option might be, I'm assuming those students have phones at the very least. So most web conferencing tools, like the one that we're using right now, Zoom, when you set up an event in the tool, not only do you get a link to the web-driven version or the software-driven version of the meeting, but you also get a phone number, so students could dial in with the phone number as well. There's apps that go with certain learning management systems. A word of warning with those, though, if you're going to use the app on your phone or iPad, not all of the content's going to appear correctly, and you won't have access to the entire course if there are assessments or things like that. Sometimes those don't work, so you might have to come out with a workaround for those kinds of things. I have a couple of colleagues across the country right now who immediately reached out to me, and before they contacted me, they kind of came up with their own plan, and they were having students take photographs of things and emailing photographs of written work, for example. So that's one reaction to that.
I think also something to keep in mind is that not everything has to be synchronous. So of course, if students don't have any computer or any internet, that is going to make matters a little bit complicated. There might be locally some stores that make hardware available free of charge or at a low cost. So that's something to look into. But assuming that somehow students can connect, for example, through their mobile devices, I think rethinking how we structure our interaction with the students will be key.
I think that's the first thing, is rethink how you're going to interact. Getting everybody online at the same time is going to be impossible, especially for larger classes. What I'm instructing my teachers to do, first of all, is to first restructure their content so that the majority of it's delivered asynchronously, and then what synchronous time they have is devoted to conversation, practice, and really just touching base with your students and finding out how they're doing at home and what they need help with. I'm also letting them know about the community options for internet access that are out there, such as when I hear that Cobb County schools are checking out 700 Wi-Fi hotspots to students, so that if they have students in Cobb County, they know that they can approach a school about that. Or Xfinity, Comcast Xfinity has opened up all of their Wi-Fi hotspots. And in the Atlanta area, there are a lot of them, which I can even log into one from my home. So that is not a high-speed option, of course. So I wouldn't require students to do a lot of high-speed things over that Wi-Fi hotspot, but know that they do have access to it. So just familiarizing yourself with some of the commercial and community options that are out there, and sharing that with faculty, with teachers, with parents, with students.
And ideally also maybe surveying your students to get a sense of what their situation is. Do they have access to mobile devices, to laptops, desktops? And what are their internet connections? Do they have a wired connection? Are they using their mobile plan? Is that unlimited? Just to gauge, to figure out how can you address what you want to do? How can you maintain your ultimate pedagogical goals given the circumstances that your students find themselves in?
Mm-hmm. And if somebody in their house has a smartphone, they can talk to their provider. I've heard of providers that are allowing unlimited access for people who are already customers to turn their phones into Wi-Fi hotspots. So maybe they can't be online at the time your class is going on for a synchronous thing, but if somebody in the house has a phone, then they might be able to use it as a hotspot to log in and get your asynchronous material. All right, shall we go on to the next question? Will Zoom be able to meet the capacity when thousands log in? That is a $64,000 question right there.
Yeah. I don't work for Zoom, but I do know that all the instances that I know of with my faculty using Zoom over the last week, and even going into this week, there were really no connection problems. The only issue that I really heard of was the Zoom cloud. You know, Zoom allows you to record your screencast or your meeting to its cloud instead of recording to the computer to get a file. And the processing time for a lot of those recordings was a lot longer than normal. But other than that, I hadn't heard of any issues. The Zoom leadership was in a conference call with some of the leadership of WCET, W-C-E-T. It's a big online group, and they were describing all the additional servers that they have as backup and things like that. It sounded like they had a really good plan for handling that.
Mm-hmm. And how important is it to have a wired connection? Shannon and I were talking about that right before he came on, and it's not impossible to do these things over Wi-Fi. It is better with a wired connection. You have fewer drop-offs, you have fewer connectivity issues. Everything seems to move a little bit faster, a little faster buffering. So is it essential? I would say not from the student perspective. Is it essential from the teacher perspective? No, not essential, but definitely better.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that a wired connection is typically something that's required for a lot of online courses, especially those that have high stakes testing in them, right? So if you have a nice diversified gradebook where no one thing counts so much more than others, that you need to use things like lockdown browser and monitor or some other proctoring servers, things like that, or you have timers set on your tests or anything like that. Those are things, by the way, you probably shouldn't be doing right now. Then it's not something you have to worry about, right? So I would move away from those high stakes tests and use lower stakes things with multiple attempts where possible.
And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to drill a hole in your wall and drop in an Ethernet connection. You can get a 50-foot Ethernet cable and run it temporarily from wherever your cable modem is to where you're setting up your office to use during the times that you're online doing synchronous things. Otherwise, Wi-Fi is pretty standard.
And I think something in general with all the technologies that we're talking about here, think about your traditional face-to-face teaching. Sometimes you plan on using the computer in your classroom and it won't turn on, or the projector won't turn on. So just like in your general practices, have a plan B. Mm-hmm. Think about, what are you going to do should Zoom not connect, or should your internet connection drop? So just be prepared for the inevitable. And I think something underlying everything is lots of unknowns, high stress, lots of anxiety on the side of instructors and students. So just breathe and be flexible, right?
Yeah, and it's okay to admit that to your students as well. So you'll be discovering these things as they happen sometimes in your course, and you will not have had a backup plan in time to address it. And that's okay. So just allow yourself the space to fumble every once in a while. You can go back and address that by adding a note to the syllabus. If this happens, then we'll do this, things like that. As you move forward, I think that's normal and okay.
Yeah, I wrote a note to my students last night and I said, hey, I'm super stressed. I've been at the computer all day. There are bound to be mistakes in here. When you find them, let me know and we'll work on them together. That's that very human kind of, this is hard. None of us signed up for this. Can you give guidance to those who teach languages that use non-Roman script or right to left languages?
Yeah, so depending on what you are trying to have your students do or how you are trying to display writing possibly, in Zoom you have the whiteboard feature that functions literally like a whiteboard. So you could simply write on there and show how right to left works, or how non-Roman characters are drawn, typed, written. So it depends on what you want to do. A lot of learning management systems do allow for text entry to be adjusted to accommodate different scripts. So it's not impossible, but it really depends on exactly what the objective here is.
So Angelika, when you're talking about writing right in the whiteboard screen, are you suggesting using like a tablet and a stylus, and logging in with a tablet and a stylus as opposed to a desktop?
Yeah, that would be so much easier. We've played around with that, and it's complicated if you're trying to use the mouse. It's easier if you're on a laptop and you have a trackpad. We've tried to connect phones or be on the phone at the same time as on the laptop, but then that never quite worked out, where we could project just the iPhone so we could use the finger to scribble on the screen. So again, depending on what the objective here is, that might work. If it's just typing different characters, a shared Google Doc will work wonders too.
That's a good idea.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Next slide. Oh, legal questions. Are there any FERPA regulations about conducting classes online? I'm thinking of offering synchronous language classes online for minors, and several people have recommended checking FERPA regulations.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. In a webinar that I did earlier with my faculty today, the question came up: if you do record and a student does not want to be recorded, what do you do? So from our institution here at Cornell, our understanding is When anything happens synchronously where new things are taught, we are required to record that to make the recording available to students who can't be online at the same time for whatever reason, so that they can go back and watch it later. And if we record directly to the cloud, that gets pushed directly to our learning management system, and that falls under FERPA rules. It is protected under FERPA that way.
And that's what I was going to say. Keep it under username, password lockdown, whatever it is, you should be safe. Yeah. There's also the old trick of, I don't know how far this gets you, the old trick of back when I was taking language classes in high school, we ought to have these fake target language names in class. So you could take that as far as you want to in the virtual world as well.
Well, and on Zoom, it's super easy to change your name, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And also, this sounds like when the person says, I'm thinking about doing this for minors, it sounds like it's a private school setting or a homeschool setting. And I would suggest looking into Google Classroom and setting up a Google Classroom that way.
And I think with minors also in particular, communicating with the parents and letting them know exactly what's happening in the virtual environment, how things are captured, how they're recorded, how they're shared, who will have access. But I think at the university level, we are a little bit more protected and have more or easier options where we don't have to think about all those implications.
Yeah, we've got course management systems and legal departments already.
Yep, exactly.
So related to question 1, if it's indeed possible to offer synchronous online language sessions for minors, how can languages be set up so they meet all criteria for inclusiveness and accessibility?
That is also the million-dollar question.
I think accessibility is a goal and not just something that you achieve tomorrow, but it's definitely something that you should be striving for. I think you should get your hands on a good rubric for online instruction, like the Chico rubric or the QM rubric, and find out what the parameters are that you think you should be addressing and go from there. I think in general, you want to stay away from the big no-nos in accessibility, right? So images with no alt tags, using multiple ways of marking off text with highlighting and underlining and bold and italicize and colors and things like that, videos that don't have captions with them, etc. So go for the low-hanging fruit and then move forward from there. For inclusiveness, hopefully that's already something that you're doing in whatever modality your instruction was before the last few weeks. So you can kind of adjust that plan and move forward in the virtual environment as well.
And the third question is also related to accessibility. And we keep hearing that schools are not able to offer enrichment programs online because not all kids have computers and or internet access. Are there ways to get around this? Any government schemes we can direct people to? We covered this a little bit on the last slide. I don't know of any government schemes. Perhaps in the relief package that'll be coming out, there might be something for education to provide for online learning for those students that are affected by the digital divide. But in the meantime, it's going to be up to individuals, I think, to find alternatives through internet service providers in their community, through schools. I've heard of people driving up outside of McDonald's to log into their Wi-Fi to do work, using your phone as a hotspot or a smartphone as a hotspot. So there are ways to get around it. There aren't any coordinated efforts to get around it.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, depending on how big an issue this is in your own course or course says, it may be just a matter of coming up with alternative assignments for those few students that this applies to. I mean, if it's an entire class, that's a totally different conversation. But, you know, I think just kind of keeping flexibility in mind and giving those particular learners some other way of addressing whatever the objectives and outcomes are.
Okay, believe it or not, I'm trying to advance the slide. I've gone all the way to the end.
Nice. And we're done.
And we're done.
Bye.
Engagement.
All right, nice.
Yes. As we go through this hard time, what are the best ways to spark students' engagement? Is giving homework assignments and or quizzes the only solution? I hope not.
Right. I want to see what these engaging quizzes are, by the way. So, yeah. So please share those. Anyway, yeah. So if you're going to survey your students, it might be a good idea, to ask them those questions that we talked about earlier. Do you have computer access at home? Are you okay? Do you need anything, etc. You may want to also ask, if you haven't already done so at the beginning of the term, what are you interested in? What are you passionate about? What kind of problems do you want to solve in the world? What do you want to major in? Those kinds of questions. And maybe keep that make a short list, a table, and keep that next to your computer where you work, and grade and prepare content for next week. And keep that list in mind as you come across current events in the target language, or things like that. And maybe see if you can build activities, or at least news announcements with using that content.
So I think that now is a really great time to reacquaint yourself with Bloom's taxonomy. And there's even a digital Bloom's taxonomy and a second Bloom's taxonomy out there. But as you remember from your teacher preparation courses, the top part of the triangle are things like creating. Students create things, and students take ownership of tasks and projects. And so one way to spark students' engagement is to turn that over to them and say, given your interests, here's a project you can work on. I'll be here to help and serve as a resource, but now we're going to work on, you've got all the foundation information that you need. We've done a couple of practices. Now let's go do some task-based learning and come up with a really creative project.
I love that. Yeah, infographics, projects, Pinterest boards, all kinds of Padlets. Sounds great.
Interviewing your parents, relatives, other people in the community on the phone.
I also think something that we need to remind ourselves of is that we are experts at teaching our subject matter, right? We know what we're doing. The only thing that's changing right now is the environment and the modality, and we won't be able to achieve everything that we would traditionally do in a face-to-face environment in this new virtual environment. So we do need to make some concessions, but I don't think how we engage our students is very different from what we did before. For languages in particular, I think this might be a good time to think about proficiency-oriented teaching. Talk to your students about ACTFL's can-do statements. Those might be a nice guideline for the students to know what they can accomplish with the language, will allow them to chart their own progress in their own proficiency advancement, and might also give you some ideas of what you may want to do to help them engage with the language, with one another. And then just think about the affordances of the online environment. What can you do in a learning management system? How can you create some discussion posts where students can actually respond to one another? So not everything has to take place in the synchronous environment.
That's right. Yeah. So you can use those kind of opportunities like discussions, or VoiceThread is basically just a discussion on steroids, right? So or Flipgrid, one of those kinds of things, and you'll be surprised at the kind of production that you'll get from your students when they're speaking in the VoiceThread. The kind of fear factor is gone because they're not immediately on the spot like they might be in a face-to-face class, so they have time to think about their answer and participate more wholeheartedly sometimes.
So what are some strategies for facilitating student-to-student engagement in an online classroom?
So in Zoom, we have breakout rooms, which is fantastic if you want to do small group work or pair work. You can simply have the students break out into a corner, just like in the physical classroom. As the teacher, you can jump into these different breakout rooms to see what the students are doing. This is particularly wonderful for language classes where you want the students to practice speaking. If you think about collaborative writing assignments, again, Google Docs, I think, are really powerful. You can set up different documents ahead of time for your students. Again, with that, you can also monitor what they do. This can be synchronous, it can be asynchronous. Those are some some thoughts that I have.
And you could take those activities that you were doing, as you go down the chapter in a book, you come to one of those activities, turn to your partner and do these things, right? You can very easily have students do those together asynchronously as well, using those same tools that we just mentioned, like VoiceThread, for example. That's a great little opportunity to do that same kind of activity in an online environment. Peer review is another great strategy. So if you're teaching writing, like above fourth semester, you have like heavier writing courses, peer review might be useful there. So give your students some good peer review questions to go and review one another's work.
And I'm a fan of games and gamification. If you can find some online language games that students can play together and report back on that experience, that at least gives them an opportunity to do something interactive together. So the last question is, I'm looking for suggestions for successful ways to provide instruction and facilitate activities asynchronously. We've covered several already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a wiki might be another one. So if you have a role play exercise where students have to come up with a dialogue or a scenario or whatever it is, a role play is a wiki is a great way to do that kind of thing. Put students in a group and have them flesh that out in a wiki.
In terms of providing instruction, one of the things I've worked with my faculty on is to break up their instruction into short videos and say, and record it in whatever video program you're comfortable recording in, and give a small 3 to 5 minute bit of instruction, and then say, now let's go do this activity that I've already uploaded into your content management system. And so they always have that face time with you. You're giving them the instructions yourself. It's still a personal touch from the teacher, and but then break it up into small bits so it's not a talking head for an hour.
That's right. It's very important that we do that, because that now that Trish just said, it means something else in the online environment. So that now is going to be happening at 30 different times with your students, right? So you want to chunk out your course as much as possible into smaller digestible chunks. Typically in the online environment, people work in these little fits and starts. They'll log in and do something for 20 minutes, knock that out, and then go deal with the kid, and then log in again, do something else, and then make dinner, etc. So help your students deal with the current crisis by rolling out your course in a way that lets them succeed, right?
And I'm going to go one step further with that and say this is a time when we need to be transparent to our students. And we all have made lesson plans where we've broken down and chunked our class time into the first 5 minutes we're going to do this, the next 2 minutes we're going to do this, and they're going to do this activity. Just go ahead and create that breadcrumb trail for your students. Share that roadmap with them so they know. First, I'm going to watch the introductory video. Then I'm going to go do these exercises in my book. And then I'm going to come back and do this online activity. And then I'm going to take this quiz. And then I'll watch the next activity. Go ahead and give them a path to follow.
And I think if you have slides that you would share or that you would use for your 5-minute pre-recorded video, or any document that's annotated with your notes, ideally share that as well. Because again, not all students will have the same type of internet access. They might not be able to watch the video, but they may be able to look at a document that they can download that's marked up with your comments too. So just trying, and that goes back to inclusivity as well. So students with different types of access will be able to follow along with your materials.
Yeah, you really have to think of the front end of the store when you're preparing content to be delivered in the online environment, because we know what it's supposed to look like, and we know the way things are supposed to go down as we're developing these exercises. But for the end user, it looks quite different, right? So you really need to be explicit and say, while you're watching this video, these are the hot burning questions that I want you to think about, right? And after this video, you're going to go report back by doing this reflection or whatever it is, right? So go ahead and preface everything and give explicit. It sounds like you're talking to your 3-year-old child. Yes, it does, but it really helps. And other tricks like that include sending out a weekly welcome to the week message. Welcome to week 9. These are the things that we're doing this week. This is the topic that we're covering. It's important in the course because of these reasons. These are the outcomes and objectives that we're addressing. These are the specific activities that we're going to do. Here's where they're located. Here's how you do it. And here's when it's all due. Right.
And so there's this old joke that I know says, I don't mind if God takes the wheel, but does he always have to lock me in the trunk while he's driving? and in a way, this is how we've operated our classrooms for years. We've had the plan and we haven't shared it with the students. We've just asked them to ride along with us and trust them. And now it's time to give them the plan too. So I'm trying to advance the slide again. Apparently this is...
While you're doing that, I'm going to interrupt with a couple of things that people brought up in the chat. One is you mentioned games. Somebody mentioned Kahoot, and I've heard people talking about that they have used it successfully on Zoom. And then the other question is not related, but you can respond to what you would like to. Can students who went back to China still view and use Google Docs or Google Drive? Can students view YouTube videos? Does anybody know the answer to that question, including people in the chat?
In China?
In China.
I know I
don't
live there. Yes, they can have access if they have a VPN connection. University may already have instructions for them to use a VPN, but that's the only way around it.
I'm sorry, guys. Apparently I am having issues with this. Okay.
It's okay.
So what are some resources? Oh, did you have any more, Shannon?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. What are some resources that we can use to have our students still communicating in the language? Again, we've covered a couple of them already, VoiceThread and wikis.
And I think something to keep in mind is that now is not the time to try out 15 new tools, right? I think we all need to focus on our pedagogical goals and getting our students to learn as much as we can in whatever amount of time we have left for the semester. You don't want to overburden yourself with trying to figure out a new tool. So, everybody talks about VoiceThread and Flipgrid. If you've never worked with it and you have to teach tomorrow, maybe not do that. Maybe stick with something that you know. And keep in mind, anytime you introduce something new, and that could even be introducing Zoom or introducing more in-depth work in your learning management system, make sure you show to your students what you're doing and what they're expected to do as well.
Yeah, that's definitely a great idea. Try to keep as much of the course as possible within the learning management system to make that as much of a one-stop shop as possible. The more opportunities you give students to click on something that opens in a new browser or in a new software program, the more likely it is you're going to lose them and not be able to get them back, right? Because now they're watching cat videos instead of, so try to keep them in the learning management system as much as possible. So be prudent with tool selection.
And also, it creates confusion with students if you're sending them something through one medium and something through another thing and telling them to go here and get that, then they lose track of where they're supposed to find the information they need in order to succeed. They don't know.
Yeah, and a lot of learning management systems, you also have the opportunity to have students record their voice. So not everything that they submit asynchronously has to be a written document. In Canvas, for example, there are many opportunities for students to either upload a recording or record directly from within the learning management system. And I think for languages, that is particularly important. And I think that actually addresses the next question as well. How can we carry out communicative wow, say that word 3 times fast. I can't say it. CLT. How can we carry out CLT remotely? Again, I think none of our underlying practices should change. We know how to elicit language production from our students. We just have to rethink how we're going to do that in the online environment. But there are enough tools that are at our disposal through Zoom, through the learning management system, and also through third-party providers where we can maintain what we have been doing in the face-to-face environment.
Yeah, and you'll get a feel for being able to demonstrate that kind of thing in the target language. So where you were doing, where were you when you were giving explicit instructions to do a particular activity in the target language, and you might be worried that writing out those instructions is just not good enough, you can make a video where you're demonstrating the thing as well, just to kind of get the point across without having resort to default English.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any special recommendations for teaching remotely in an immersion setting or in an intensive setting? I'll be honest, I haven't done any immersion teaching.
Well, there's some housekeeping stuff. You could change the language of interface for whatever tools you're using to the language as well.
That's an idea. How can we continue to work on oral proficiency using low bandwidth tools in case of limited student access to video conferencing?
Voicemail.
Yeah, voicemail.
A Google Voice phone number would be great for that.
Well, and even with Zoom or WebEx, there's a call-in number. Mm-hmm. And I think on the free accounts for Zoom, they've disabled the call-in numbers. But if you have an institutional account or have a personal account, I think it's only like $150 a year for the upgrade Zoom account. Then you can just give your students a call-in number, and they can call in using their telephones. Now, of course, that's talking on the telephone is one of the trickier and more higher proficiency skills, but there is that opportunity.
WhatsApp could be an alternative too. FaceTime, depending on if you are comfortable communicating with your students in that realm and having them be friends with you in a WhatsApp group, but you could create a separate group for that. So again, I think it depends on what your students have access to, what your students are familiar with, and what you are willing to do outside of the more traditional channels through your learning management system.
That's right. Yes, it's all about TikTok right now. So get people in TikTok.
It's true. Holy cow! I changed the slide. Okay. How can I keep and build in a community-based quality to a course when everything is closed and we and students need to isolate? Well, video conferencing is one way, of course. And then just being upfront. Part of, I think, being a community is being able to say to your students, I was going to do this today, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to do it. What do you think? You know, why don't you help me out, guys, here? What are you comfortable doing? What do you think is the next way to do this? And let them know that they're part of a community of learning and not just sage on the stage. Hopefully we weren't already sage on the stage in our classrooms, but now more than ever, it's important to cultivate a community of learning in our classrooms.
Yeah, this might be the occasion to incorporate some, not necessarily hands-on level service learning, because you're supposed to be practicing social distance right now, but maybe exposure to the problem and proposing solutions to the problem, right? So within your community, what issues are there, either as a result of COVID-19 or some other issues that you already care about as a community, and maybe focus on exploring potential solutions for those things in the target language.
And there might also still be ways to connect with an outside of the classroom community via social media. Look at what that community is doing, how they engage, and whatever the problem is that you are trying to solve. So I think there's different ways to also connect with the outside community.
That's right. There are also those anonymous messaging apps people had just mentioned, like GroupMe and Remind. You know, so I can easily see a cool course like this, almost like a next door kind of version of a course, right? So my next door in my neighborhood is just a bunch of nosy people complaining about noise, but you know, I could see it easily becoming something much better using those kinds of group messaging apps.
Mm-hmm. Differentiation. How can we differentiate our instruction to meet the needs of learners who are struggling with the content prior to the school closing?
Well, how were you doing that before? Were you giving them extra time to take a test? Because you can do that in the learning management system, right? So what was the particular accommodation that you were doing? All of those things can be done remotely as well. But, you know, there's kind of the classic tool bag of things you can do. In a lot of online courses, we didn't have a lot of text. It tends to be text heavy. Break up that text with images and videos instead. So to give people different ways of wrapping their heads around whatever the topic is. Infographics are very useful for that. Venn diagrams, things like that. So give multiple kinds of learners opportunities to deal with whatever the content is. There are tools that might be already part of your learning management system that allow for this on their own. So if you have Ally that's connected to your learning management system, you may not have already known that your students can listen to a recording of your course, or see captions, read the captions that go with the video, etc. So those are some ways.
Also, I think articulating to your students how they can get a hold of you outside of whatever happens synchronously. So if you're in a university setting, having your regularly scheduled office hours, however you want to schedule those and deal with those. If you're in a K-12 setting, maybe thinking about ways how can students get in touch with you outside of whatever material you present to them synchronously as well. And then also, when you do talk to students about how to get a hold of you, make sure that you are very upfront about what's your response time. Because I think now that we're moving into this online environment, people think a lot of what's happening is immediate. And so they might have that expectation that they send an email and within a minute you respond. Don't put that pressure on yourself. So be very clear about your own communication plan and how people can get a hold of you and in what time frame you will respond.
Mm-hmm.
Allowing for projects and creativity will help with a lot of this as well.
Oh, assessment. How can I grade a bunch of written assignments if there's no online version of their homework?
Well, I hope you're moving away from whatever format that came in. But if you have a backlog of stuff that was left over before this big crisis happened, then, you know, like I said before, you could do like my colleague was doing with their students, having them take a picture. There are apps that will scan to a PDF and let them submit that to you.
Well, and on an iPhone, actually, in the Notes app, you can do that directly. You take a picture and it PDFs it, and then you can send it, email it, whatever. So that's very easy. I think for some more high stakes assignments and assessments, you can certainly move those into your learning management system. End of school year, end of semester assessments, there is no reason why you can't one for one do exactly what you would have done in a paper and pencil test.
Right. And the next thing is cheating. And this is a question I get 5 or 6 times a day is how can I offer exams online and avoid cheating?
Well, there's my standard responses to this are as follows. So if you are going to continue to do those kinds of exams, well, hopefully you will have created a culture where the temptation to cheat isn't there or isn't as there as it could be. So having a diversified gradebook, having a discussion about what academic integrity is and what does it mean to cheat your way through a degree. What is it? Do you want your nurse who's sticking you in the nose? Have you seen that awful meme going around of the person getting swabbed for COVID? Yeah, it's hard, so frightening. Do you want that nurse to have cheated her way through nursing school? You know, so have you had those discussions with your students? Have they been a part of creating what the ground rules are for cheating in the course? Do you have an honor code at your institution? Maybe you have proctoring tools that go with your learning management system, like Respondus Lockdown Browser and Monitor, where the student has to show their ID and it films their testing environment and it videos them while they're taking the exam. So those are some ways also. Do you have a timer set on the exam? Do you have a short testing window? Are you randomizing questions? Are you randomizing answers? Are you randomizing sections of the entire exam as well? So those are some options.
And I think trying to discourage the use of translators, translating apps, depending on what you want your students to showcase, having those things happen synchronously with you, where they have to respond to a question, you interview them in the target language, or again, if you're on a Google Doc together, you can see what the students are doing. But yeah, I think maintaining the same level of or the same expectations that you would have had in your face-to-face classroom should still apply.
At the beginning of your face-to-face class, did you take them through the exercise of showing them what an online translator does in both directions, right? So put a piece of text through it and show them what it looks like and have them point out what all the issues are, and then do it in the other direction as well to show them how incomprehensible that garbage is. So that might be a little video that you could make to pop into your online course just to show how terrible a practice that is.
And how to make exams online if the rest of the semester goes online, and how to make group presentations when each student is isolated. Two separate issues. Lots of ways to do exams online through anything from Google Forms has a quiz function now. And then there's Respondus if you have a license through your institution for Respondus. And I'm sure there are other, you mentioned a couple, George.
Yeah, I would stay away from test banks while I'm on this topic. You know, if you're going to use the testing materials that came with the book, you might want to think about tweaking the language in those questions to kind of match your own teacher language, because lots of times what happens is people will dump those test banks and they're written in some other voice that's not your voice, first of all. They're also written by TAs, so sometimes they're wrong. So, you know, just be careful with those things. Rewrite them, or maybe just throw out most of it and use the ones that require critical thinking, like open-ended questions, short answer questions, and writing instead.
I think sometimes also when I design a test that's meant to happen within an hour-long classroom, I tend to put in an hour's worth of content there, not because that's what will give me a good assessment of their abilities and their proficiency, but because I have that flexibility to put an entire hour's worth of content in there. Maybe now's a good time to look at your test and say, do I really need to assess all these different things? Do I need to ask 19 different questions on this to be sure that they understand this concept? And shorten it to the short answers, the essay questions, things like that.
I also think depending on the guidelines from your institution, students are very stressed about their grades. And I know many different universities are approaching this differently with having pass-fail only or still doing letter grades. But I know for a lot of students, their grades are very important, and they're really worried about what's going to happen if they don't do well in one of these exams that they now have to take online. So, I mean, as we've been saying, diversifying the assessments that you have your students do is really important. And maybe encouraging students to showcase what they can do rather than having them feel like they are being tested on something that they will be graded on that then will drag down their GPA entirely.
Yeah, that's right. I agree completely. I think that, and I saw something about this scroll by in the chat window, that if you're teaching an online class and you're not using one of those scary Big Brother proctoring tools that watch you, which are very unsettling, by the way, then you can assume that people are cheating. So write your tests in that way. Make it an open book test and write your tests in that way. So you might as well throw out your old assessments and come up with something new that allows for that, right? And still lets you test on what you're looking for.
That's my favorite suggestion so far, George. Just assume they're cheating. And then group presentations, how to make group presentations when students are isolated. I think in this case, I would have them do some kind of I would ask my students to do some WebEx activity and record it so that they're in there together. They're driving the WebEx activity. They're communicating with each other, setting up WebEx times to have those conversations and work together to come together and plan their presentation. Then as they do it, record it and then share it with the class that way.
These have to be very carefully planned and deployed and prepared for in the online environment. It's not just something that happens like tomorrow. So you'll need multiple check-in moments and multiple accountability moments that lead up to that group presentation. And you probably also want to think about including some rate your group member type of grade in there as well, just to kind of keep the accountability going, because when people hear group presentations or group project in an online class, they go, oh Lord, here we go. I'm going to do all the work. I'm carrying the load for this thing, right? So just be prepared for that kind of thing.
And then going back to, these are really extenuating circumstances. I think it's okay to take a look at it and go, why are you doing group presentations? Is it because you have 30 students, but you only have time in your class for 10 presentations? Well, maybe we can restructure the presentation and have them do an individual presentation that they upload and people can watch and comment on them. You know, really just go back to, why is it a group presentation?
Is that a learning outcome? You know.
And we've talked a lot about final exams, I think. Anything else you wanted to add about final exams?
Well, if they were high stakes before, I would find a way to juggle that around and allow for some moments of flexibility in your grade book, right? So, so that thing doesn't count for 25% of your grade anymore, or at least if it does, maybe there's multiple attempts figured in, or some other way of demonstrating that knowledge.
And again, I think thinking about the field that we're in with language education, I personally believe that looking at proficiency gains is so much more important than looking at, can a student respond to a multiple choice question, right? So this might actually be a wonderful opportunity for all of us to rethink how grading happens. Of course, it's difficult if our school district tells us we have to provide a letter grade at the end of the semester, the end of the school year. But think about what you can do, how you can rethink how students can chart their own progress and articulate what they've been learning, maybe also through a portfolio.
That's right. Yeah. So either the ACTFL can-do levels. I was thinking earlier of the Council of Europe passport, right, where you mark things off in your passport, that kind of thing. So what kind of portfolio building project can your students do instead of the traditional final exam? The fact that these things are being carried out and done and delivered to the audience in electronic format is great for portfolio, for proof that you're meeting this particular level of proficiency. So it's actually a benefit that they're doing this using technology.
So my understanding is we have about 8 minutes left in this webinar. Is that correct, Shannon? And so let's kind of move through the resources. Any resources where tips and strategies are compiled? I just heard that ACTFL opened up all of their content. So the ACTFL website?
Much of their content, not quite all. But
oh, okay. And I know there are several Facebook groups going around.
Well, and of course, IELTS. We will actually
yes.
the IELTS Summit this weekend, where we will be talking about what we can do maybe as a clearinghouse for a lot of these resources. For now, the FLT Mag is a wonderful resource. If you're looking for how do certain technologies and applications work, go there.
But again, I think to go back to don't try to do everything this week. Don't try to take on too much. Don't try to learn a lot of new things.
Yeah, and that takes me to the second question on that slide is, I think, pick the few resources, webinars, websites, etc., that had an impact on you when you were looking at them, and choose those to curate and collect and share with your colleagues. I don't think you should be worrying about having everything in one place right now for your hub that your faculty are going to go to. So just like you're supposed to be streamlining your course, I would do the same for your colleagues.
And are there any good examples of interactive remote teaching in the areas of humanities? that you can name?
They've never happened before. No, just kidding. So, yeah. So if you're a Blackboard campus, Blackboard has Blackboard exemplary courses. So that's one thing you can go and look at. So contact your Blackboard rep or contact your technology office on your campus and see what the Blackboard exemplary courses are in your humanities area or social sciences area or language even.
And use your personal network. Things like this where so many people connect during a webinar, follow up on social media. If you have heard of somebody who has done great work, I think educators in general are so wonderful at sharing best practices and ideas. So reach out to your colleagues and take advantage of the knowledge that they bring.
Should we consider an approach to teaching without giving grades as some colleges are doing? We're at the high school level. Well, that is something that, for us that even at the college level, we're not allowed to do. That it'll be the Board of Regents for us that decides if we're going to go without grades or pass-fail grades. So I don't know how much latitude you have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same. Here in Texas, we have some folks clamoring for a pass-fail option, right? So yes, you can earn a grade, but you can get maybe a pass-fail option in the course, but that's way above my pay grade. So I think that's something we should worry about when we're told that we can worry about it.
Yeah. I think it's something everybody's considering, but we can't actually make decisions.
Yeah, but I mean, if you want to argue for it, then by all means, present that up the chain.
And I'm going to skip the next question because we've covered a lot about the digital divide. Emotions. Since last week, which was exciting and inspiring, by the way, thank you, Lauren Rosen, I am increasingly overwhelmed by the size of the task and the number of potential problems. How do I keep my own sense of "arr" out of the picture so that my students don't pick it up? Let them see it.
Yeah. Let them see it. Find ways to unwind. Find ways to disconnect. One of the things that I've learned about working from home over the last week is that I'm having a hard time putting my phone down and deciding what's work and what's not work. What's my personal lifetime and what's not my personal lifetime. By all means, draw the line. You have to draw the line. You have to find ways to unwind too, just to kind of get your minds off things. So I found a great YouTube channel that's teaching me how to do all these crazy dances. So I've been dancing like an idiot in front of my television. So that's how I keep my sense of arg out of the picture. And also just remember that you're doing this for them.
And you know what? One thing to do maybe at the beginning of every synchronous time when you talk to your students, check in with them too, and take a couple of minutes to just, check in on a personal level and make sure people are okay. And maybe talk those things out. I mean, this is stressful for everybody.
Yeah.
And I think just make sure that you are very realistic with yourself and with your students in terms of expectations.
And what can administrators do to ease the burden on instructors and students? I also have an administrative role. And so what I did is I encourage my students to, my student workers, to not be in front of their computer all the time. I tell them, it's unbearable to sit at your computer for 8 hours a day. So while you might have a expectation that people are still going to be working on 8 hours a day, expect that they'll also get up and go to visit with their colleagues for a little bit, even if their colleagues are fluffy and are on the bed next to them. Expect that they're going to get up and go have lunch. Let them have opportunities to go out and reconnect with their family and with the sunshine, and just tell them, I don't expect you to be online all the time. And that's something I also tell the instructors that I work with, which is when you're planning your course content, don't plan out so much that if you were multiplied by 5, that's how much time students would have to be in front of their computer.
And in our area, at my institution, one of the administrators kind of felt powerless about what was going on, and I've never taught online, so I don't know how to deal with any of this. Kind of felt disconnected from the problem, and people had to remind that person, well, you know what? You have a PhD in marketing, so you could come up with some nice motivational social media campaigns to keep the students engaged and motivated and wanting to keep going and continue. So that was one strategy that I thought was what turned out to be a success. That administrator who didn't even want to connect with dealing with the issue found his way to pitch in and help out.
These are my favorite questions. How do you think new teachers can deal with online classes? How can we tell our colleagues and students to know and consider the importance and positive effects of learning with technology? Wow, I've dealt with that every 5 minutes for the past 3 weeks, it seems. So, George, how do you talk about?
Yeah. So, well, at first, when this topic came up, I thought, well, you know, it's going to be super easy for me to keep the difference between remote teaching or whatever it is, this thing that most people are doing right now is, and online teaching, right? Because online teaching requires a lot of preparation and faculty development and knowledge of course design and online course facilitation, social presence, blah, blah, blah. And that's different from this other thing. But it turns out it's not really that different from this other thing, because more often than not, adjuncts get handed a section the day the semester begins, or a day after the semester began, or a week before, saying, hey, you're teaching this online course, go do it, right? So a lot of people learn by trial, by fire. So I think if you just kind of treat this as a source of faculty development for yourself, as ridiculous as that sounds, you can document where your stumbling points are along the way. And so keep a note, keep a little journal of all the things that went wrong. And the next time, because there's probably going to be a next time, that you have to roll this out again online, you'll know to go back and revisit and redesign and address those issues. And you'll have more time to do it, by the way. So treat it as a source of faculty development, as tried as that sounds.
And Angelika, you started to talk about affordances earlier on, and technology affordances was one of my favorite topics when I was in my doctoral program. So can you talk more about how to look at technology as affordances rather than as a limitation?
Yeah, I think it forces us to rethink what is really important, right? I think in our day-to-day teaching, especially for more seasoned teachers, we've done the same thing for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and we never really think about what's important to our students right now. So I think moving into an online environment makes us think about how students move in this online environment, how we can best address how they learn, what is interesting to them. I think the way that we connect with people online is different. I mean, I've noticed these last 2 weeks, I connected with so many more people than I would have had I just gone about my life normal day-to-day pre-pandemic. And of course that's brought on by anxiety and checking in with people. But I think you can do a lot in the virtual environment. And one thing, again, that I would like to stress is take advantage of your colleagues, take advantage of your peers. One thing that our institution has done is actually mobilizing all the emeriti and seeing if they can maybe lend support to some newer faculty members, or maybe sometimes if you're in a Zoom call, and it's really good to have a Shannon who sets everything up and who monitors the chat, because when you're focused on teaching, you can't do 15 other things and see who's raising the hand and who's asking questions. So think about other people who are around you, how you can bring them into the fold.
I just had an idea. In my daughter's preschool class, they have somebody called the Lucky Duck of the Week, and the Lucky Duck of the Week gets to change the calendar dates and change the times and water the plants and stuff like that. You could even go to something like that, where in your online classes, if you're doing something synchronously, your lucky duck of the week could be the person that advances the slides, such as I'm doing, or monitors the chat, such as Shannon's doing. There are literally 4 of us, 5 of us doing different jobs while this instruction is going on. And what do you think the future of education will look like in the post-coronavirus pandemic?
I think that should be a new webinar once we're out of this.
I love that. Yes. I know, I hope that it will look more exciting and more vibrant than ever before, because we've been shaken down to our foundations. And I think good stuff comes out of that.
Absolutely. And what I don't think some people have been worried about, well, you know, now we're finding out that we can do just online teaching and we don't have the need to have brick and mortar universities and schools anymore. I personally don't think that that will be what's coming out of this, because there is nothing like good face-to-face interaction. And as we're all diving into this, we will notice that you can't do exactly the same thing in a virtual environment. Different approaches, you can still test your students, you can still provide input, you can still have them interact and engage with one another, but there are fundamental differences between learning online and learning in person.
Mm-hmm. And I think that we'll value the things that we can do face-to-face more, mm-hmm. But we'll also value the things and the artifacts that we can create online.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And apologies in advance, but I see a lot of drudgery and committee work having to do with contingency planning in the future. Yes. So, you know, I'm sorry. I know it's going to happen, I'm sure. So as soon as we return to normal, there's going to be all these awful meetings about having all these backup plans for things mm-hmm. that weren't in place before.
But I will say that Georgia State hasn't officially made an announcement, but we are all planning on just going ahead and continuing through in an online environment through the summertime. So we're going to get a chance to do this for a while, I think. And it will, the more we do it, the better we'll get at it, and the more comfortable we and all of our students will get at it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right, I believe that's the last slide.
Yeah, thank you so much. We've run out of time already, but we really appreciate your time and your expertise and your help in dealing with these burning questions. IELT is planning to have some more webinars in the near future. So please follow IELT's Facebook page, and we'll be posting those as they get organized. Thank you so much, Trish, Angelika, and George.
Bye,
My
everyone.
pleasure.
Pleasure. Good luck, everybody.
Take care. Stay healthy.
Indeed, yes. And breathe. Be good to yourself.
Yes, be kind.